Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. Today, we are in Arizona at Petrified Forest National Park, and I had the honor of sitting down with lead archaeologist and park ranger John Hards. John and I talked about the rich cultural story that exists here at Petrified Forest National Park. Our conversation takes us all the way back to 13,000 years ago, leading us up to Route 66, which we'll talk a lot about in our next episode. But for this conversation, John and I talk about why Petrified Forest is world-class for archaeology. John, I am thrilled to be able to chat with you. You are an archaeologist at Petrified Forest National Park. And like we usually start on this podcast, I'd love to jump into your journey with archaeology. When did you fall in love with it?
Sure. I've been an archaeologist for about 25, 26 years now. About 10 or 11 of those spent with private sector archeological firms, and then the last 15 to 16 spent with the federal government, primarily the National Park Service. I think I really fell in love with it in college. I was kind of midstream studying biology, and had a good friend that was taking archaeology and anthropology classes, and they said, I think this would be right up your alley. And I took a class, Intro to Archaeology of North America, and I was hooked. I never looked back. I switched majors, and, that's back many years ago, more than you need to admit. And then here we are. Yeah, it's a fantastic thing, and I feel very, very fortunate to still be part of it, several decades into it.
Archaeology is kind of a broad term. So what area of archaeology do you typically focus in?
Sure. So in the broadest sense, I'm a North American archaeologist. And in the last 10 years, I've really focused on the cultural area, of the American Southwest. And then within that, I study the subfield known as zooarchaeology. And that's where we study animal remains from archaeological sites. Usually, there'll be animal bones, but it could be feathers, it could be skin, it could be eggshell, things of that nature. It could be marine bivalve shells, but any sort of animal remains at archaeological sites is kind of what I focus on the most within the field.
Is Petrified Forest National Park kind of the mecca for you to be able to study that type of archaeology?
In a lot of ways, it really is. And when I say a lot of ways, it's the arid climate. We have a really consistent weather pattern here that allows things to preserve incredibly well. A lot of the North American archaeological record, animal bones just don't preserve. You might find them in a rock shelter or in a cave, but out here, if we happen to excavate even an open air archaeological site, animal remains tend to be preserved pretty well because we have that consistent arid environment.
In our time together, I want to focus all the way back to 13,000 years ago when it's believed human occupation started, although humans have occupied this area likely since time immemorial.
Sure.
So can you take us back as far as we can go in this park and what we understand from human occupation?
Yeah, absolutely. From an archaeological sense, we're very, very fortunate at this park to have exactly what you're speaking of. We have evidence of a tradition we call the Clovis tradition, which I'm sure most folks are familiar with. It's around 13,000 years old, primarily known from their really stylized, beautifully artistically made spear points that preserve quite well. We have a number of those sites in the park. Maybe what's most interesting to me, again, it comes back to those animal bones, about Clovis peoples is that they were inhabiting this landscape side by side with now extinct fauna. Now, we haven't found any of those faunal remains preserved just yet in the park, but these folks were living alongside and hunting, harvesting, North American camels that no longer exist, and short-faced bears were there, and all just these massive mammoths, for example. Everyone's familiar with woolly mammoths. Around here, we had Columbian mammoths, which were less hairy and significantly bigger. And these people were highly, highly nomadic. So they would move all around the landscape, hundreds and hundreds of miles. It seems to be one of the primary purposes was to procure high quality stone for manufacturing their stone spear points. And that's clearly what drew a lot of these early 13,000-year-old people here is the petrified wood. They were able to use that and make these exquisite spear points. That's what we know as far as the earliest cultural tradition here. A lot of folks are probably hearing on the news about White Sands, which is not terribly far east of here. If those things are accurate, which is sounding like they may very well be, that pushes it back another 8,000 or 10,000 years. So as archaeologists, we're pretty excited about the fact that we still have all these big questions that can be answered about the earliest people that we know of, at least for physical evidence of when they were here. So yeah, 13,000 years for right here, but there's a good chance that we're going to end up going back quite a bit further than that.
As an archaeologist, when you discover, arrowheads and spear points, and then put it in the context of Petrified Forest National Park and see that those spear points are made out of petrified wood, is it always enthralling to you when you get to see that, descendant communities utilizing the resources that are around them in different areas of the world?
It is. It's pretty incredible. I think even just knowing how you take a raw piece of stone and work it into this thing that any of us today, if we saw a complete Clovis Point, would consider it a piece of art, a work of art. And to know that people were traveling exclusively on foot hundreds of miles to procure that stuff. And we do see those spear points in some what are called mammoth kill sites all the way down on the Mexico border. So they're pretty distant from here. Knowing that people transported that stuff is mind-blowing. Of course, there were intricate trade networks and other ways that objects moved, but we know that people were willing to come here because they had heard about these rainbow colored, like wide spectrum of beautiful colors, raw material that, especially, I guess, if they heat treated it, it was really workable.
You had mentioned the extensive trade network that is known to have run through here. Is this area historically known as more of a destination or a corridor?
That's a great question. And I'm going to say that my experience here, it was absolutely both of those things. No doubt about it. It's a crossroads. The Puerco River runs right through here, which is a major tributary of the Little Colorado River, which then, of course, ultimately goes into the main Colorado. So river corridors back in those days were the superhighway for movement of things. Artifactually, in the archaeological record, we find artifacts that come from cultures to the east, to the west, to the north, to the south, in every direction. So we know in that sense it was a place where people were moving through, but they were also staying here long enough. And we may chat about this a little bit more later, but simply the fact that some of our Pueblo complexes are the size that they are, we know people settled down here for long periods of time too. So it wasn't simply just the movement of goods, but it was also a place that people called home for many generations.
You mentioned that you find artifacts that are typically found in other locations of the country. How do you know when you find an artifact that it's not from or made from this location, but rather transported here?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It depends, of course, on what kind of artifact it is. Well, say if we find stone tool that's made out of obsidian, we simply don't have that raw material here. So we know where the nearest locations are. In this case, more than likely a place in New Mexico or a place over near the San Francisco Peaks in the Flagstaff area. That would be obsidian. Ceramics sometimes can be a little bit trickier, but we can look at the material that they were made out of and often track them back to another location. Sometimes they're just blatantly an exotic material. We'll find olivella shells that are a marine shell that you only find on the West Coast or down in the Gulf that, again, would have to have been transported hundreds of miles. And we do find a number of those marine resources here. They can be a little bit more localized, but you can assume that they were transported in, like we'll find turtle shell in archaeological sites. And we simply, to our knowledge, have never had the environment here that would have allowed a viable population of turtles to survive. Now, it's not too terribly far, maybe 60, 70 miles to the south, we have those types of environments. So sometimes it's just obvious. For example, we have depictions of macaws, and we know macaws are native to Mexico and not native to North America. And so we know that they had to have been traded or transported one way or another to be here. And then an inverse of that, of course, is the petrified wood. It has a particular signature to it that we know is local.
And as an archaeologist, naturally, you're a storyteller. And when you find those materials that you know were traded or brought here, like the macaw, is it hard for your mind not to run and think about that type of story or that interaction where that trade occurred?
Yeah, it's something that absolutely fascinates me. For example, you brought up the macaw. We have macaw motifs on our ceramic vessels. We have macaw motifs all over our rock imagery panels, but we have yet to find any physical remains of macaws. So as someone that studies animal bones, that's something that I'm really kind of hot on the trail of.
We're talking about this being a destination and a corridor, but is there evidence that this landscape in particular was a sacred place for descendant communities?
Absolutely. I'll start with the archaeological end of it, but I think, frankly, there's a more important end of that. Archaeologically, we have some sites that, given the types of features they have and the imagery in the petroglyphs, really, really appear to be like there were offerings there. Where they're situated on the landscape can strongly suggest that, this view gives you the cardinal directions, things of that nature. But more importantly to me is I've been to a number of these sites with some of our tribal neighbors, particularly from Zuni and Hopi, and been to places where they refer to them as a shrine, and they describe all of these features that make it that. And so, yeah, absolutely. We know that some of these places not only were, but continue to be very special places to people now, these descendant communities. Having the privilege of being able to visit some of these sites and watch people give their version of their prayers to it, or maybe even an offering, then you don't really have to question that there's a deep, deep tie and a deep, deep meaning to the landscape here.
I'm glad you said not only in the past was it sacred, but currently today it's still a sacred landscape. Yeah. How many descendant communities are associated with Petrified Forest?
Sure. We have 36 federally recognized tribes that call this place either home today or deep connections to it, where they know on their important migrations to where they call home now, it was a landscape that they passed through and left their mark on. And it's a place that, if I can go into a little bit more deeply, indigenous descendants don't see these things as ruins, for example. They'll see a Pueblo complex as very much a place that's a living, even probably breathing entity on the landscape. It's a part of the landscape that still houses their ancestors. And so it's a place that, while we can trade ideas and I can give my archaeological perspective to them and they give their current tribal perspective, which very much, I should say, complement each other oftentimes, it's fantastic to see how for those groups of people, these are not just physical remains that might be deteriorating back into the ground. They're still a very, very special place, like I said, that their ancestors still inhabit, and they will come to them to speak to these former family members and things.
Are you always amazed by how ingrained the indigenous communities are with the landscape, the respect that they have for the buildings that they put up here, and just how they interact with the environment, the amount of respect that goes into the landscape that they thrive on?
Yeah, I really, really am, because I can fancy myself an outdoors person and someone that absolutely respects the natural world. But the connection that our tribal neighbors have, it's so intertwined that you can't disconnect the two. They are part of that landscape. The landscape is part of them. And maybe I'll leave it at that it's just an incredibly special, powerful connection between the two that's really, really something to behold when you get a chance to share it with someone.
You brought up the Pueblos that are here. Can you describe what those are like, and you mentioned how massive they are. How many people did they typically have in a pueblo in this environment?
Yeah, we have pueblo complexes that might be anything from a small little 5-bedroom dwelling to we have a site that happens to be the largest pueblo structure administered by the Park Service in Arizona. It's a site called Wallace Tank. And while it's never been fully excavated, in fact, it hasn't been excavated at all, what we do know about it, what we can see about it from the surface, it's a minimum of 600 rooms. So that is a huge scale. That is a massive complex. I've heard people just spatially compare it to the size of like a super Walmart to give you an idea of the footprint on the ground. And so that would have housed hundreds and hundreds of people. And it's really a truly impressive thing. And that one dates from about 1250 to around 1400 is when that would have been primarily occupied.
That's amazing. This park is known for its rich history with paleontology. How closely do you work with the paleontologists in the park? And is there ever crossover between, a site that you discover, or maybe they discover that they realize has cultural significance and they need to consult with you or the descendant communities?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say there's a pretty good collaboration that goes on all the time between the archaeologists and the paleontologists. And a lot of that is based on the fact that their understanding of sites and their interpretation of them kind of boiled down to understanding zoology, understanding how to recognize these former creatures' skeletal structure. And that's what I do in archaeological sites from a much closer sort of modern age. And so when we go out to these sites, I will often work with those guys to have them help me identify things, for example. Or we even have a site in the park that doesn't appear to have any cultural twist to it, but it's a fissure, sort of a cave-like fissure that we're working together to just see what kind of biological diversity comes out of there. Our hope is that we'll excavate it down deeply enough that we'll find some now extinct fauna from kind of late Pleistocene the period, but we'll see. Time will tell with that.
That's tremendous. Do you ever find that there's a cultural site that also has, animal skeletal remains?
Yeah. So that, as I was mentioning, that tends to be what I study the most. It's my subfield within archaeology. With the preservation that we have here of skeletal remains, and I'm referring specifically to animal skeletons, not human remains, the preservation is fantastic. And so, like Wallace Tank that I was referring to, just little samples I've taken out of there, I think were upwards of like 15 different species of animals, all things that we would currently find on the landscape today, other than maybe the turtles. And so, it's out there, and we find that mix all the time. Now, these are much more modern in the sense they're the last 1,000 to 2,000 years old, versus my paleontology friends are working with things that are hundreds of millions of years old. So a very, very different time around here.
Do you find any relationship between the species that you find out there and the humans that have lived here for thousands of years?
Absolutely. And again, coming back to having some of our tribal neighbors come out and do site visits with us, that's where that deep connection gets made. When I have found things like badger bones or bear bones in sites out here, to me, I'm trying to interpret what was the use of those. Were they ceremonial? Were they a food source? Were, as you mentioned, maybe a domestic animal? We do have domestic dog remains, things of that nature. But what some of our tribal friends will often get really enthusiastic about is like, oh, wow, you found a badger. I am part of the badger clan, or I'm part of the turtle clan, and you're finding these here. Those are very, very meaningful to have in these sites. And so it informs a part of that site that I wouldn't be able to understand on my own. So there ends up being this collaboration because of what species are found out there. And to me, they're important in this one way, but I find out they're very, very important, and even more so in another way.
Another special thing that visitors can even see in this park are petroglyphs. Where are petroglyphs located in this park? And, what are the significance of those petroglyphs that you've seen here?
The simple answer is petroglyphs are found everywhere in this park. We have a handful of pictographs, but by far mostly petroglyphs, and they are found throughout the park, honestly, from corner to corner, in the middle. It doesn't always even have to be a pristine rock panel where you think, wow, that's a perfect palette for a petroglyph. It can be a boulder that's down near a wash. We've been starting to find more and more petroglyphs that are just on these flat surfaces right at the current ground surface. As far as some of the meaning for those, that's a tricky one. They're very tough for an archaeologist to interpret and know that they're interpreting it accurately. I think a lot of them can be simply observational in nature. Many of them are current animals that you just see out there. It'll be a badger. It might be a hawk or an eagle. Some of them are spirals, which are solstice markers oftentimes. And so they're marking the seasonal changes and helping indigenous people of the past know when the crops were going to be ready to harvest, or when it's time to plant, or when it's maybe too early to plant because there may be a frost. So some of them are very utilitarian, I think, in nature. Some of them are observational. Some of them are more chronicling migrations of both animals and people. So I think they do a little bit of both. We have, I should note, moved away from calling them rock art and kind of moved more toward the term rock imagery to capture petroglyphs and pictographs, purely because who are we to say what is art or was intended to be art? Certainly there was a masterful artistic ability to create them, but we don't always know what the intent was behind the creation of them.
That's a great point, and leads me into my next question, which, as an archaeologist, I'm sure you're always eager and chomping at the bit to uncover stories and to be able to tell stories, especially with the public or people who are curious about this park. But is there a fine line where you have to hold yourself back and tell yourself that might not be your story to tell, or that not knowing the story is okay?
Archaeology is very interesting in the sense that, especially in North America, most archaeologists are studying someone else's history and someone else's early prehistory. And so it's a balance that we're constantly trying to strike. And so I'm very cautious not to overstep what the evidence is telling us. I try not to stretch that too far. The rock imagery is a good example of just saying, hey, that seems to depict a hawk. I don't know exactly why someone wanted to depict a hawk. It could be observational, as I said earlier. It could be a place where you could collect hawks for ceremonial purposes or things like that. But I tend to let our indigenous partners inform that end of it. So whenever I get the chance to be out in the park, say with my friends from Hopi, I'll ask them those questions and say, hey, what do you think about that rock imagery motif right there of XYZ? And more often than not, they'll share with me what the meaning is to them, why they think it may have been created. And that just feels more appropriate to me, so that I'm not making a bunch of assumptions and getting way off track. And I often try to remind myself, too, in archaeology to say, this is what we know so far, or this is the oldest site we have documented thus far. I don't say this is the oldest site in the park, because tomorrow we could find one that's older. And so I try not to be too absolute about it, I guess, is my point.
And kind of how I led off this podcast, we have evidence from 13,000 years ago, but, the reality is descendant communities would tell us that they've been here for forever, since time immemorial.
Absolutely. And who would I ever be to disagree with that? I just run with the archaeology as far as I can, and am very well aware of the fact that there could have been people here hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years before that. We deal with the evidence that we have. That's the very definition of archaeology, is that we interpret things from the physical evidence. And so if we don't have the physical evidence, it doesn't mean that it's not out there somewhere or didn't happen. We're just limited by what we can observe.
You touched on it already, but when you hear about stories that are coming out of at White Sands, does that excite you as an archaeologist that, you might, discover or come across something in Petrified Forest similar?
You bet. And honestly, not even so much me discovering, I'm just excited that it's there. We've had archaeological sites in my time in archaeology that have been pushing that boundary of what we used to call pre-Clovis. Now it's just like, yes, of course, there's stuff before Clovis. Getting maybe into that 15 or 18,000 year realm. So to start to see this physical evidence with really good dating, as far as I can see, that pushes it back 21 to 23,000 year range, it's very exciting. Yes, I would love to find those things myself, but I think I'm pretty much equally excited for our neighbors of their White Sands, and maybe would love to come visit over there at some point. But yeah, it's fantastic. I think because I love how many questions we just haven't been able to answer in archaeology yet. I love the future of it in that regard.
You've mentioned Clovis a couple of times, and you went in depth about Clovis a little earlier, but can you describe who or what Clovis people were like in this area and just in general?
Yeah, I think I mentioned a little bit of it, but they were what we know of them. And again, it's important to emphasize that we use the term Clovis because the first of those style of spear points happened to be found in the vicinity of Clovis, New Mexico. We have no idea any way of knowing what those people 13,000 years ago called themselves. So that's very much an archaeological construct to call them Clovis. But what we do know is that they were people that were on the landscape, on the move a lot. We find very, very few examples of long-term encampments or anything that we would define as a village, for example. We do happen to have one site in this park that we consider an encampment because of the type of activities we can reconstruct from the stone tools there. But we don't know if they were there on the order of days or weeks. We kind of know why they were there because there's a freshwater playa, and freshwater is quite the commodity here. And it would have also, of course, drawn herd animals to it and things like that would have been of interest to those folks. So again, just highly mobile, incredibly skilled flint knappers or makers of these stone tools. We know because of the evidence from coast to coast that so-called Clovis people were from Alaska to Mexico and California to Maine. There happened to be more Clovis points percentage-wise or overall number-wise in the eastern half of the country for whatever reason. But we have ample evidence of them here as well. And again, like I mentioned, what probably fascinates me the most about it is to know these people were out on a landscape that probably looked quite similar to how it does today behind us, but a little wetter at least, probably a little more consistent flow in our washes and our rivers. But they were out here with these massive animals that just aren't here anymore today and interacting with them, because where preservation allows, we find the remains of those animals in Clovis sites. And it's fascinating. It's really fascinating to think of people right on the same landscape, that we're on today, but walking next to mammoths and saber-toothed cats and things of that nature.
That's incredible. And they probably viewed animals differently than we do today in a lot of different perspectives, obviously as a food source, but probably this massive amount of respect for the landscape and the species that they share the landscape with.
Yeah. And if I go back to our friends at White Sands, those footprints reveal humans walking in the same trails as giant ground sloths and mammoths and things like that. So it actually shows the evidence for at least some degree of interaction or proximity to these incredible creatures.
That's amazing. Obviously, your colleagues here, paleontologists, are studying Triassic bones from the Triassic era. From the animals that you have discovered over the thousands of years of occupation, as we move up kind of the timeline from the Triassic era into obviously modern day, what are some of the skeletal animal remains that you've discovered here that are of particular interest to yourself?
Yeah, I kind of alluded to it earlier. I am particularly interested in things either that aren't common on the landscape now, like these reptiles or amphibians, purely because we're such an arid landscape. Or I'm particularly interested as well in animals that I don't know how you would procure, particularly in the past when you didn't have modern implements to help you. And what I'm kind of getting at is we'll find golden eagles, we'll find red-tailed hawks, all these incredible raptors in these Pueblo period sites. And I often ask myself, how were those acquired? I don't know. I can guess as to what some of the uses were, more use of feathers when it comes to some of these birds. But how on earth, a golden eagle is a massive avian predator and something that must have been quite the thing to try to acquire. We have found domestic dogs, so of course it's always really interesting to think about those relationships that continue today with our best friend, right? To know that they were here thousands and thousands of years ago, interacting, probably protecting some of the gardens, probably hunting companions, and just companions like they are today.
Because you have seen a lot of, I'll say, more modern animals that could exist today compared to the Triassic period, are you able to see visual adaptations that we see in the animals that are roaming the landscape today, or able to pinpoint, like, this animal has evolved to have these traits today, but I have the skeletal remains of it pre that evolutionary period?
Yeah, I guess the quick answer is no. I don't tend to have that advantage of that depth of time to see that type of change. The closest we tend to come to that is finding domestic or semi-domesticated turkeys and then dogs that we were mentioning. So you'll see some change in those, but those are very much human influenced change. So I don't have that, I guess, advantage of time to see evolutionary change per se. So one of the things I do find particularly interesting are some of the species that suggest this just trending change over a long time of the environment. And I think a good example of that would be that we've found sandhill cranes in at least 3 of our different archaeological sites. We don't have any historical record of sandhill cranes being here. We don't tend to have what they're seeking as far as feed and the type of ecological niche that I understand them to need today. So that becomes particularly interesting for our biologists too, because they want to know that those things were here historically, because maybe it's something that we have interest in trying to reintroduce today, perhaps, something like that. Bison are another good example of that. I have not found bison right in this park, but we have found bison remains in neighboring sites. And so it can sort of beg the question of, should bison be here in a modern context, perhaps? So yeah, anyway, that's one of my favorite things, is seeing stuff that is noteworthy compared to our modern biodiversity.
How does the geology of this landscape assist your work? Does this geology make it easier to find archaeological sites and then work through those archaeological sites?
It does. It does tend to help. I would say a lot of it for me is more the vegetation cover, which goes back to the geology, of course. We have these loose, oftentimes unconsolidated sediments that will have these savanna and desert-like plants. And so for me, there's often really, really good visibility. And that's for archaeology what it comes down to. If I'm going to go out on this landscape and inventory for new archaeological sites, I need to be able to see. And so if you look at the Badlands behind us, it's a really fantastic place to prospect, if you will, for new archaeological sites, new to us, of course, because you can see them, you can find them. And again, the geology too, combined with our climate, it's pretty arid. And so I know if I find the right sort of dune feature, for example, and there are artifacts in the vicinity of that, the preservation is probably going to be really good.
What's the balance between excavating an archaeological site, but also preserving the natural landscape around you?
It kind of goes back even maybe a little bit further than keeping it in place. We don't tend to excavate very much in general. And some of that is for cultural sensitivity reasons. Some of it is purely, do we have the need to? So we'll do these very, very small scale samples of a site, for example, what we might call a little shovel test unit, just to see what sort of intact subsurface deposits there may be. And part of that we're keeping in mind, we want to keep that archaeological site largely intact for the future when we have better methods to investigate this stuff. Even in my time in archaeology, things like LIDAR have come leaps and bounds so that we can understand what might be buried in an archaeological site without really even putting a shovel or a trowel into it. And so we keep that stuff in mind. We also are aware that we're in a national park. And so if we're in a place particularly that's highly visible to our visitors, we don't want to have a hillside that's all been dug out. We don't want some visual scar on the landscape. And so that's very, very important to us. And so we try to be really, really discreet, really, really minimal about how much we investigate subsurface or excavate sites.
How abundant are pottery sherds in this area?
Pottery sherds are incredibly abundant in this area. And they go back several thousand years here. We have evidence of the earliest pottery manufacturing in the region here in the park. And then they continue all the way up until the last few hundred years here. And so it's, they are, I guess, arguably our most obvious artifact that we have out on the landscape. And they're also one of our artifacts that's most helpful to archaeologists because they've changed through time pretty consistently with styles, thickness, the temper that you were using to manufacture them, the pigments you may have been using, or how many pigments you were using. And so we can often assign a relative date to a site purely by what ceramics are on it. Now, going in the weeds just a little bit, what gets tricky with that is many of our sites were used, maybe vacated temporarily and then used again, vacated temporarily and used again. So we can have ceramics that cover a spectrum of 1,500 years in the same site.
From your perspective, as we move up the timeline, what does it look like? What did that transition look like going from these descendant communities into this area becoming kind of more of a corridor with the Butterfield stagecoach coming through here, obviously Route 66? How did this time period and when did this time period start to shift from everything we've discussed to more of this transportation route across America and becoming the southwest of the United States?
Yeah, so I mean, for time immemorial, there have been trade routes through here, and there have been paths, and then you just see this slow progression that probably really ramped up around the time of European contact in this part of the world, where then you start to see, of course, introduction of horses later on, and so your paths start to become a little more formal. Those start to become roads, of course, with the introduction of the vehicle, and those roads are built on top of the earlier paths. And then, eventually you get up to Route 66 and then something that becomes I-40 adjacent to it and where it crosses it. And so, really it's been thousands and thousands of years that we've had the corridor and sort of trade network, right? Or just people passing through the area. but I would say the last 500 years where it's really ramped up to become more of a place that people pass through, certainly still living here, but a little more of a transient sort of aspect to it.
Is it mesmerizing to see how quickly things progressed in a specific area? I mean, we're talking 13,000 years ago, the landscape, being preserved and utilized, and obviously being a sacred place. And then we're talking about a couple hundred years where it evolutionizes and changes so drastically. As an archaeologist, is it mesmerizing to witness how quickly things can change?
Yeah, mesmerizing might be a good term for it. It's a little overwhelming, in some ways, historically, when you try to wrap your mind around it, because in a lot of ways, there are obviously exceptions to what I'm saying, but people were doing very, very similar things for 10,000 years, 13,000 years, and then it just rocketed in this sort of different direction with technology, right? And so I would say largely with the horse coming in, and then certainly vehicles later on, where people could travel across the country and come to this part of the world with relative ease. It's hard to wrap one's mind around, because especially when you're working in a geological context, a lot of time it's that figurative blink of an eye that we went from there being no roads here and no mechanical vehicles here to suddenly we have an 80 mile per hour highway not too far from where we're sitting right now. So it's a blink of an eye. Yeah, it's a change that's mind-boggling. At the same time, I'm very, very happy as an archaeologist that our park preserves all of that, right up into 60, 70, 80-year-old medicine bottles and automobile parts that are right out there that are every bit as much artifacts nowadays as far as how we interpret things as earlier things.
I'm grateful for your work and archaeologists' work all around the country. And one thing I think about is, even thinking about Mesa Verde, is just how humans' capacity for movement and type of movement has changed so much. We can go to Mesa Verde and you see these incredible cliff dwellings. Mm-hmm. You can't help but think, like, how did they get into those houses and how did they build them up these steep cliffs? And the reality is humans' capacity to move, vertically as opposed to horizontally, and horizontally has changed so drastically. Off camera, we were talking about how maybe less than 1% of people go out into these badlands behind us. Mm-hmm. But thousands of years ago, people were, moving and maneuvering through this landscape in ways we probably can't even comprehend today.
100%. I'm reminded of that all the time because I hike and I backpack, and sometimes it's right here in this park. And I'll find myself thinking from a 2025 perspective, oh, wow, I'm out in a remote area. And inevitably, I find stone flakes from where someone was retooling one of their stone tools 2,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. And people were everywhere. And they weren't afraid to move about and go find the resources or go see what was over in those mountains that are way on the horizon. And so the stark contrast between that and how today we may drive around for 5 minutes to try to find a closer parking spot to the storefront, it couldn't be any different in my mind. These people were doing everything until the last few hundred years 100% on foot, carrying all the water you need for the day, carrying your children, carrying all your hunting, foraging, gathering gear with you. It's quite an incredible feat, that human beings were so successful on this landscape for so long. And that's what fuels me as an archaeologist.
Would you agree that what we consider wilderness today, this amazing landscape behind us, was just considered home to humans thousands of years ago that were here?
Absolutely. And I would even maybe take it a step further that aside from wilderness, even indoors versus outdoors was viewed very, very differently. I think when you spend your life on the landscape, not going and visiting it or going to a park on the weekend, that line was very, very blurred. And I think there was more just the thought of where some of the extra special resources might be on the landscape. But yeah, things as we frame them today as far as wilderness or outdoors or remote, I think would have had no bearing back 1,000 years or further back.
I think there's a lot of misconceptions for visitors when they come to Petrified Forest National Park. They hear forest, they might think they're stepping into a forest national park. That's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of layers to it. Mm-hmm. The truth is the park is alive. There is a lot of life out there today. Sure. It is an incredible park for paleontologists, but the cultural story is also rich. For those that are coming, whether it's a day or a couple of days, how would you convey that cultural story to them for them to really appreciate this landscape?
Sure. I would start maybe with some numbers and say, we've only had the opportunity to inventory about 20% of this park for archaeological or cultural resources. And we already have recorded upwards of 1,400 individual archaeological sites. So if you extrapolate that, I think there's easily 5,000 or 6,000 individual archaeological sites in this park. It's truly a world-class archaeological place. We have some fantastic front country examples of that, like Newspaper Rock and Puerco Pueblo and Agate House that people can visit. I think what makes us maybe a little different is that from, say, a Mesa Verde or a Chaco Canyon, which are just these fantastic park units, is that a lot of our archaeology is maybe a little more discreet, or it's far in the backcountry where people don't have that ease of access to it, but it's there. And when I say discreet, some of it's maybe not standing. It's not 3-story wall like you might see over by Pueblo Bonito. But it's there. It's incredible. I think I mentioned earlier, it's 600 plus room Pueblo. That is a huge, huge community. And it's right here. So yeah, we're known, and rightfully so in a lot of ways, as a paleontological or Triassic or fossil park. And we absolutely are that. But we're also a world-class archaeology park that I, cherish the opportunity to share with people.
I want to give you the floor to talk about anything that we maybe haven't mentioned yet, but that you want to leave the listeners with.
Yeah, I think maybe it was another one of the things that we started to touch on a little bit, but I find it incredibly important to remind people of a couple factors relative to archaeology in this park. And one of those is that we have a continuum here. We tend to interpret archaeological resources like they just stopped when the historical period started, but they didn't. And our descendant communities, our tribal neighbors, our indigenous neighbors, they did not disappear in any way, shape, or form. They migrated to different locations, but Hopi's just up the road that way. Zuni's just down the road that way, for example. So I think it's really important for me to remind people that while there's this incredible fingerprint on the landscape from our indigenous neighbors, they did not disappear at all. They're right here. Many of them are my coworkers and my friends and my neighbors, literally and figuratively. So that's maybe an important part. I deal with the past professionally and the prehistoric past, even as far as humans are concerned. But there is no end date to that. Our clock just keeps getting pushed further forward. Artifacts continue to be made, whether they're historical, whether they're European in nature, or whether they're more indigenous in nature. They're there. And so archaeology is a moving target in that regard. We've kind of put this basic timeline of something being roughly 50 years old or older. First of all, it's just a rough guideline. But secondly, that target, of course, continues to move. And so, yeah, the archaeology here is incredibly rich. Please do come visit if you get a chance. It's a fantastic, fantastic place for cultural resources, and a place that I'm really privileged to work at.
John, thank you so much for this conversation. Your work, like I had mentioned earlier, is really important and incredible, and I hope gives people a lot of unique perspective when they visit this park and see it as a place that potentially harbored dinosaurs and had harbored dinosaurs, but also a place that has seen a lot of incredible stories and a lot of incredible people. So thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure, and I'm glad you could come to our backyard for a few days and spend some time with us. Thank you.
Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. John is an incredible archaeologist, and the cultural story here at Petrified Forest National Park is phenomenal. So if you like this type of content, it'd mean a whole lot to me if you followed or subscribed on whichever platform you're watching or listening on, as it really does help out our podcast. So until next time, safe travels.